In the summer of 1940, a battle of unprecedented scale raged in the skies over southern England, a conflict that would determine the very fate of a nation. Britain found itself under relentless assault. For the pilots of the Royal Air Force, the war became a terrifyingly personal affair. As one pilot recalled, without any warning and suddenly, about a dozen Messerschmitts came down on us. Out of the Sunday, the sky, once a sanctuary, was now filled with the dreaded silhouettes of the enemy. The Messerschmitt 109s, their yellow noses glinting, swastikas and stark black crosses marking them as predators. Winston Churchill had foreseen this terrible reckoning, calling it the Battle of Britain, a struggle upon which the freedom of the British people would depend. And in this crucible of fire and steel, one aircraft would emerge as the enduring symbol of Britain's will to resist, to fight on, and ultimately to win. For the men who flew it, it was more than a machine. It was a partner, a savior, such a wonderful machine to fly. The Spitfire's grace in the air was legendary, a quality that inspired a deep, personal bond with its pilots. It could turn, side-slip, and perform all the violent maneuvers of aerial combat with an ease that felt intuitive, an extension of the pilot's own will. For those involved in its creation, there was a profound sense of pride, a knowledge that they had crafted not just a weapon, but a masterpiece. It was, in the eyes of many, the most beautiful aircraft ever to take flight, a perfect fusion of form and function, and it was, unequivocally, a fighter. The genesis of this legend can be traced back to 1931 and the prestigious Schneider Trophy Air Race, where a brilliant designer named Reginald Mitchell unveiled his Supermarine 6B, an aircraft that shattered records, achieving a staggering speed of 340 miles per hour. Its victory marked the third Schneider Cup win for a Mitchell-designed aircraft, cementing his reputation as a visionary. Mitchell was a brilliant, if sometimes tempestuous, designer and a remarkable leader of men. His true genius lay not only in his own vision, but in his uncanny ability to select and inspire the perfect team to bring that vision to life. At this time, the Royal Air Force was perilously behind the curve. Its frontline biplanes could barely muster speeds of 220 miles per hour. Alarmed by Britain's growing vulnerability to a new kind of aerial warfare, the RAF issued a call for proposals for a modern single-seat fighter. At Supermarine, Mitchell's initial design, known as the Type 224, was the first response. The Type 224 proved to be a bitter disappointment. It was underpowered, with a sluggish rate of climb and a top speed of barely 240 miles per hour. The Air Ministry, needing a plane immediately, awarded the production contract to the Gloucester Gladiator, a capable biplane, but a biplane nonetheless. Frustrated by the design compromises forced upon him by rigid specifications, a fire was lit within Mitchell. He began to work, in his own time, on a completely new type of fighter, an aircraft born not from committee, but from his own singular, revolutionary ideas. His vision was for a warplane with 8 machine guns firing forward, an enclosed cockpit, a retractable undercarriage, and all the aerodynamic refinements needed to achieve unprecedented speed. These refinements were crucial for producing an aircraft capable of extraordinary velocity. Mitchell championed the revolutionary concept of stressed skin construction, a method where the aircraft's metal skin was not merely a covering but an integral part of the structure, bearing a portion of the aerodynamic loads. This technique, which allowed for a lighter yet stronger airframe, was a lesson learned from his racing seaplanes that would be carried directly into the design of what would become the Spitfire. To power this radical airframe, Mitchell knew he needed a truly advanced engine, and he incorporated into his design a groundbreaking new power plant being developed by the Rolls-Royce company, a 12-cylinder, 1,000 horsepower, water-cooled engine of immense promise. This engine, initially designated the PV-12, would soon be christened with a name that would become legendary in its own right, the Merlin. It was a marvel of engineering, a complex symphony of over 15,000 individual parts that, when assembled, produced a roar of controlled power. The new aircraft, designated Type 300, bore almost no resemblance to its failed predecessor. Mitchell, recalling an earlier design, resurrected the use of a distinctive elliptical wing. He had assembled a dream team of specialists, aerodynamicists, structural engineers, and mathematicians. The principal aerodynamicist, a man named Beverly Shenstone, was the brilliant mind responsible for the wing's complex geometry and its iconic, beautiful shape. In December of 1934, Mitchell presented his latest plans to the Air Ministry. With its all-metal, stressed skin monocoque fuselage and that radical elliptical wing, the Type 300 was a quantum leap beyond the conventional wood and fabric biplanes that still dominated the RAF's ranks. The need for such an advanced fighter was growing more desperate by the day. Across the Channel, Hitler had embarked on a massive, terrifying expansion of the German war machine. For Reginald Mitchell, there was an added, deeply personal urgency. He was fighting his own battle, a courageous but losing struggle against cancer. The British Air Ministry, recognizing the immense potential in Mitchell's Maverick project, kept it under the closest scrutiny. Realizing that Mitchell's design was the future, they astutely created a new, individual specification tailored specifically to accommodate it. On the 5th of March, 1936, the prototype K5054 finally took to the sky. The test flight was a triumph. The aircraft achieved a speed of 335 miles an hour, and those watching from the ground knew they were witnessing the birth of something extraordinary. Yet, in a testament to his relentless perfectionism, Mitchell himself remained dissatisfied, convinced he could wring even more performance from his creation. Meanwhile, as the RAF expanded, a generation of young men, fired by a sense of duty and adventure, volunteered for service, eager to become pilots. One such hopeful recalled, "I decided that I'd like to learn to fly, but I found that learning to fly through private sources would have been somewhat expensive. For a young teenager with more ambition than money, there seemed only one path." He thought to himself, "The only way to do this is to apply to the Air Force." He recalled walking into the old Air Ministry building, approaching the commissioner, and bluntly stating, "I want to be a pilot. What do I do?" Another young man went to the recruiting office with the same dream. The recruiter's response was sobering. "You can't volunteer to be a pilot," he was told. "You can volunteer to be aircrew, and if you're good enough, you might become a pilot." Undeterred, the young man replied, "All right, I'll volunteer." The recruiter began the paperwork. "Right, well, what's your name and address, and what is your job?" The young man answered truthfully, "I work at Supermarine." "What do you do at Supermarine?" the recruiter asked. "I'm an apprentice." The recruiter stopped, looked him square in the eye, picked up the application, and tore it in half. "You go back to work, my son," he said with sudden gravity. "You're doing a better job there." While this young apprentice was unknowingly building Britain's salvation, the latest intake of recruits began their flying training on antiquated biplanes, aircraft that would soon be rendered obsolete by Mitchell's monoplane fighter. At number 604 Squadron, the primary trainer was the Avro 504N, a slightly updated version of an aircraft that first saw service in the 1914-18 war. From there, cadets went to Grantham, a flying training school where they flew Hawker, Harts and Heinz again, old aircraft, but they were all the Air Force had. In spite of his increasing ill health, Mitchell, in a heroic race against time, personally oversaw further refinements to the propeller and exhaust systems, pushing the prototype speed to almost 350 miles an hour. As for a name, all Supermarine aircraft traditionally began with the letter S. The original suggestion was the Shrew. One executive famously quipped that, with a name like that, they would have lost the war. As Nazi Germany's rearmament program continued at a terrifying pace, the British government was finally spurred into action, expanding the RAF and placing an order for 310 Spitfires at the time, the largest single aircraft order the RAF had ever made. Then, on the 11th of June, 1937, the visionary designer Reginald Mitchell succumbed to his illness. He died at the age of just 42, never living to see his creation's finest hour. The news of his passing cast a long shadow over the workforce, a profound blow to the men who had shared his dream. The people in the design department were deeply affected. One engineer remembered the day Mitchell died. He and a colleague were working in the laboratory when the news came. They both just stopped, looked at one another in silence for a moment, and then, in a quiet tribute to the man and his mission, they got on with the job. The work continued under the steady hand of Joe Smith, Mitchell's trusted assistant, who took over as chief designer. But translating Mitchell's brilliant design into a mass-produced reality proved to be a monumental challenge. The Supermarine works at Woolston was simply not equipped to manufacture such large numbers of this complex new aircraft, forcing the government to build a huge new factory. This massive shadow factory was built at Castle Bromwich, intended to mirror the work at Woolston. Lord Nuffield, the automotive tycoon, was put in charge with the hope that his experience in the mass production of motor cars would accelerate the output of Spitfires, but the Spitfire was no motor car. The revolutionary elliptical wing and the intricate airframe did not lend themselves to simple assembly line techniques. New methods had to be invented, and a workforce largely unfamiliar with the sophistication of Mitchell's design had to master them under immense pressure. A worker on the line recalled the physical difficulty of its construction. "You had to be fairly agile to work on it," he said. "You had to be prepared to bend your arms into funny places." With wry honesty, he added, "They weren't an easy airplane to work on. They were designed by someone drawing on a piece of paper. They didn't have to do what we did." Meanwhile, orders were also being placed for the RAF's only other monoplane fighter, the Hawker Hurricane. Based on older, simpler construction methods and almost 50 miles an hour slower than the Spitfire, the Hurricane was a sturdy, uncomplicated workhorse. The uncomplicated Hurricane was simpler to build and soon entered service with the RAF in significant numbers. As 1938 drew to a close and the storm clouds of war gathered, a further 200 Spitfires were ordered. The mood was grim. After the crisis in Munich, it was clear that war was inevitable, and the factories were put on a war footing. Finally, on the 4th of August, 1938, the first production Spitfires were delivered to an operational RAF squadron. For the young pilots, sitting in a Spitfire cockpit for the first time and hearing the roar of the Merlin engine ignite was a life-altering experience. It was the most wonderful noise imaginable. The sound was awesome, rich, powerful, and deeply reassuring. A pilot recalled
Soon
taxiing
becomes
out for his
apparent
first flight
when a
with a mix
109
of
went
exhilaration and profound responsibility, realizing he was about to fly what was considered the best and fastest fighter aircraft in the world.
The vital
Upon seeing
importance
his
of
first
Mitchell's
Spitfire,
vision will be
another
dictation of
pilot
the
was simply
Supermarine
awestruck.
Spitfire as the aircraft
You couldn't
that
have
will
a more
save the
beautiful
nation.
machine than that, he remembered. In the air, it was more powerful, more responsive.
The Royal Air Force
It was an
is fighting
aircraft
for
that you
survival
didn't just
against an
sit in.
enemy
It felt
determined
as
to
though
wipe
you
it
fitted
out.
into it, that
There's
it became
German
a
both
part of you.
sides that will
With a
determine the
maximum
outcome.
speed of
Detection and
362
command and
miles per
control
hour,
is
the
the
ability
finest
to
in the
climb
world.
to 20,000 feet in
Radar
just
stations
9.5
situated
minutes,
around the coast
and a wing
system,
design that
and
bestowed
plotting
incredible
tables filled with the
maneuverability,
tracks of
the
incoming
Spitfire was a
raiding
revelation.
threats.
Its pilots quickly
Hurricane,
learned to appreciate the
sturdy,
sublime
stable
qualities
gun
of this
platform is
remarkable
tasked with
aircraft.
the Spitfires.
The Spitfire was a
Because of
marvelous
this
machine
tackle
to
the
fly,
hordes of
though it
deadly
demanded
fighters that
respect.
swarm
On the
around the
ground,
bomber
its narrow
formations.
undercarriage made it notoriously tricky,
Spitfire
but once
always
airborne,
happened.
it was transformed into a
Someone
creature of its
called
natural element.
Right.
It was a wonderful, responsive
realize
aircraft to fly.
you're in
It was an utterly wonderful machine to fly because it was so exquisitely sensitive to its controls. It could turn, side-slip, and perform all the maneuvers required in combat with an effortless grace. The Spitfire simply
At the
looked as if it
start
was
of the
born
Battle
to
of Britain
fly,
in
a
July,
perfect marriage
the
of
RAF
aerodynamic
is
science
receiving 80
and
new
artistic
Spitfires a
design.
month.
For some
By 05,
pilots,
new
its
Spitfires
compact
are
cockpit
delivered
was
to
a perfect
replace the one-
fit, feeling
Though
like
the
a tailored
Hurricane makes
suit,
up the
a
bulk of
natural
fighter
extension of
command
the pilot's
strength and
will.
account
As the
for
saying
more
went
enemy
among those who
aircraft
flew it,
destroyed.
you don't
It's
fly
the
a Spitfire,
distinctive shape
you
of the
just strap it
Spitfire
on.
that
To
catches
them,
the
it
people's
was simply the
imagination.
most beautiful aircraft
Mitchell's
they had
design
ever flown in their
and the
lives.
Spitfire
In April
legend
of 1939,
is born.
despite the persistent production problems at the new Castle Bromwich factory, the Royal Air Force, now desperate, placed an order for over 1,000 more Spitfires. The clock was ticking. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within days, the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, was unleashed. German armor roared across the plains while the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, bombed and strafed, softening the target. The Polish Air Force, brave but flying outdated equipment, was simply overwhelmed by the raw power of the Luftwaffe. A Polish pilot somberly recalled, "We suffered heavy losses and we had to withdraw."
Of the Royal Air Force
At 11
does not
o'clock on
rest
September the
solely
3rd, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. At that moment, fewer than 350 of the 2,000 Spitfires on order had been delivered to the RAF. An eerie period of inaction followed, the so-called phony war, a time of uncertainty and waiting. The sense of frustration was palpable among the pilots, including Geoffrey Quill, Supermarine's chief test pilot. He shared his growing doubts with Alex Henshaw, a record-breaking pilot who had joined Supermarine as a test pilot at Castle Bromwich. As Alex Henshaw later recounted, Geoffrey Quill confided in him, "You know, I think this bloody war's going to fizzle out, and I don't think the Spitfire will ever go into production." Both men agreed it was a difficult and costly aircraft to produce, and while its qualities were appreciated by the test pilots who flew it, no one truly knew how this thoroughbred would stand up in the brutal reality of combat. An answer began to emerge on the 16th of October, 1939, when the first enemy aircraft to be destroyed by Fighter Command fell to British guns. The victory belonged to the Spitfires of 602 and 603 squadrons. A formation of German bombers was intercepted over the Firth of Forth in Scotland, and 2 enemy aircraft were shot down. Yet with Spitfire production still plagued by problems, the simpler Hawker Hurricanes were reaching squadrons in far greater numbers. Consequently, it was the Hurricanes and their pilots who were sent to support British troops in France. One Hurricane pilot recalled, 3 days after war was declared, they posted our
all
squadron
the
to
little time
France,
there,
along with 3 other
and then
Hurricane
really
squadrons.
time back again.
Initially, they saw little action, moving between various
And
airfields.
the
But in May
Spitfire
of
Mark
1940,
Vs
the
now
funny
come
war
face to
ended
face
with
with early
terrifying
versions of
suddenness.
the
The
latest
Netherlands,
German fighter
Luxembourg,
aircraft,
and
the
Belgium
Focke-Wulf
fell to the
190.
Blitzkrieg.
With a top
The
speed
Hurricane
of
squadrons
almost
in
400
France were
miles an
overwhelmed
hour,
as the Luftwaffe swept forward with the
executes turns
advancing
and
German
maneuvers
army.
at speeds that amazed
Resistance
British
collapsed.
pilots,
As
who clashed
refugees
with this
clogged the
lethal
roads,
aircraft and
the
lived
German
to tell
army
the
drove
tale.
relentlessly
It
towards the
soon
French
earns the
coast.
nickname
From their airfields in
Butcherbird.
southern England, the Spitfires were finally unleashed,
Counter this threat,
ordered to intercept the
Spitfire's
Luftwaffe
engineers
and protect
worked to
the British
develop a
army
further
as it
variant of
desperately
Mitchell's
evacuated
original
from the
design
beaches
at
of
an RAF
Dunkirk.
airfield by
Squadrons
mistake.
linked up, forming a
The
protective
German
screen
machine
70
is
to 80
examined
miles across
closely.
the sea to Dunkirk. A pilot remembered, "You could see
June
Dunkirk miles
1942.
away because
The
of this
Spitfire
enormous
Mark
column of
9.
smoke from the burning
You'll
oil
notice
tanks."
all the familiar
Flying at
Spitfire
15,000
features.
feet,
The wings
the
don't
sky
forget the
was
new
initially
features.
empty.
The longer
Then,
nose with the
without
pigeon
any
breast beginning to
warning,
disappear,
the heavens
and the two
erupted.
symmetrical
Suddenly,
radiators.
the sky was
That's
full
the
of
Mark
Messerschmitt
9.
109s.
With a top
Their yellow
speed of nearly
noses,
400
swastikas, and big black crosses
Later,
a
the wings
terrifying
were
sight.
clipped to give
For the
better
Spitfire
maneuverability at
pilots
low
and for the
altitudes.
Luftwaffe pilots they now faced,
greets these
this was
low-level
the moment of
sorties.
truth, the first great clash between the 2 most advanced fighters in the world. A German ace later admitted, "This was our first contact with the Royal Air Force, and we had a big
Generation of
respect
fighter
for them."
bombers
He
will
noted
prove
that the
more
RAF was
successful
still
in the
flying in a
ground attack
rigid
role,
3-ship
such as the
formation, but
powerful
soon
and
changed to the more
sturdy
flexible 4-ship finger 4 formation the Germans used. The advantages of the Spitfire were immediately and shockingly apparent. When a Spitfire rose with a tight turn, the German pilot confessed, "We were unable to follow." The Spitfire was naturally better. The Messerschmitt and the Spitfire were closely matched, but the Me 109E was armed with 2 7.9mm machine guns and, crucially, 2 wing-mounted cannons. These cannons fired explosive 20mm shells, a devastating advantage in firepower that the Spitfire's 8.303 machine guns simply could not match. To be effective, Spitfire pilots had to press their attacks to dangerously close ranges, ensuring their fire was concentrated and sustained. A German pilot, after surviving an encounter, noted, "I had a lot of bullet holes in the body of the plane, but none that would have influenced the flying ability." He was only able to escape the pursuing Spitfire by exploiting his engine's fuel
was the grace
injection,
and
turning
beauty
the
of the
plane
design,
upside down and
as well
diving
as the
away at
power
full
of the
speed.
aircraft
The
that
Spitfire's
captured the
lighter,
affection of those
carbureted
who
engine
flew it,
couldn't follow such a
sent the
maneuver.
spirit
With the
that
collapse
saved
of
the country
France,
in those
the
desperate
Luftwaffe was
days.
now free to concentrate its full might against Britain from newly captured bases just across the English Channel. It was absolutely crucial that Spitfire production at Castle Bromwich be stepped up if the Royal Air Force was to have any hope of defending the skies. With their backs to the wall, a sense of controlled panic set in. Britain needed aircraft, and it needed them now. The dynamic and ruthless Lord Beaverbrook was put in charge of aircraft production, and he promptly forced Lord Nuffield to resign. Supermarine's own experts were brought in to Castle Bromwich, not to run the factory, but to guide it in the right direction and finally get Spitfires rolling off the line. Full production was at last underway, and not a moment too soon. It became a desperate race against time, getting Spitfires built, tested, and flown to the battle stations on the coast. The Luftwaffe had 2,700 operational aircraft ready to throw at Britain. To meet this immense threat, the Royal Air Force could muster barely 650 fighter aircraft. Of those, only 230 were Spitfires. The odds were stark and terrifying. The pilots were under no illusions. I think those of us like myself realized that within weeks we could have the Germans landing on this island of ours, one veteran recalled. Their resolve was absolute: we were not going to surrender. But they were realists. When asked if they thought they would win, the honest answer was, we should be bloody lucky if we do. The Spitfire was about to face its greatest challenge. In June of 1940, the battle for Britain was about to begin. As the German armed forces swept all before them, the stage was set for a new kind of war. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. In the skies above, the Spitfire would meet the Messerschmitt in a fighter-against-fighter duel for the very soul of England. It was a battle of existential importance. For the German pilots, it was the final obstacle. They believed they had to achieve air superiority before the planned invasion could succeed. One such pilot, brimming with the confidence of recent victories, prepared to fly to England. He felt this was his moment, the beginning of the end of the war, a chance to finally demonstrate the full measure of his talent and experience. Racing across the Channel, swarms of German fighters attempted to draw the British squadrons into a decisive battle. The Luftwaffe pilots quickly realized the RAF only scrambled when a bombing threat was imminent. So, the strategy shifted. Bombers were brought along, targeting British air bases, forcing the defenders into the sky. As the threat materialized, British fighters were scrambled to meet it. Single squadrons, guided by the unseen hand of radar, struck the German raiders with ferocious speed and precision. For the British pilot, the moments before engagement were a trial of nerves. His stomach would be a knot of tension as he scanned the empty sky, until finally the enemy appeared. Upon spotting the black crosses of the Luftwaffe, a strange, magical sense of calm would descend, even as all hell was about to break loose. For a new pilot, the first taste of combat was a brutally steep learning curve. He had to learn to trust his eyesight, to know the absolute limits of his aircraft's performance. One young pilot recalled pulling a steep turn, shouting "brake" into his radio, only to stall the aircraft, a near-fatal mistake. It was a constant process of learning on the job. And if a pilot survived that initial, terrifying period, his chances of seeing the war's end grew immeasurably. In the chaos of a dogfight, a pilot's mind would narrow to a single point of focus. He was thinking only of the drills he had taught himself, the intricate dance of survival to avoid being shot down. Every 10 or 15 seconds, his head would snap around, checking his six, ensuring no one was on his tail. He was a hunter, concentrating solely on the target, and when he saw one, he went in like a bull in a china shop. In these moments, Reginald Mitchell's vision of a superlative fighting aircraft was fully realized as the Spitfires of the RAF clashed with the Messerschmitt Bf-109s of the Luftwaffe. In the eyes of the British pilots, their Spitfire was the superior machine. But the Spitfires of the Battle of Britain did have their shortcomings. Unlike the fuel-injected engines of the Me-109, the Spitfire's Merlin engine used a float-type carburetor, a design susceptible to G-forces. When a Spitfire was thrown into a sudden dive, the engine would be momentarily starved of fuel, causing a critical loss of power. A German pilot could simply push his stick forward to escape, but for a Spitfire pilot, that same maneuver would cause the engine to cut out, leaving him vulnerable at the worst possible moment. The Spitfire, however, could outturn the German fighters. A Luftwaffe pilot, finding himself losing in a turning battle, knew there was no future there. His only escape was to simply put his nose down and dive away, leaving the frustrated British pilot behind. The RAF pilots soon learned they had to overcome this critical problem. If a pilot simply pushed the nose of his Spitfire down to give chase, he would lose precious power and speed. Instead, a brilliant and daring counter-maneuver was developed. Rather than pushing the nose down, the pilot would execute a sweeping, rolling turn, taking the plane down at the same time. Performed correctly, he could come out just 50 yards behind the fleeing 109, a truly successful tactic born of ingenuity under fire. Yet, another problem soon became apparent: the Spitfire's fabric-covered ailerons. At high speeds in a dive, the air pressure would deform the fabric, causing the pilot to lose control as the aircraft began to turn away on its own, a terrifying feeling when precision meant life or death. The pilots were learning all the time in these desperate battles. Through their courage and skill, the vital importance of Reginald Mitchell's vision would be recognized, and the reputation of the Supermarine Spitfire as the aircraft that would save the nation was forged in the skies over England. The Royal Air Force was fighting for its very survival against an enemy determined to wipe it out. As German bombers struck at essential ground targets, it was the fighter aircraft of both sides that would ultimately determine the outcome. Britain's air defense system, a network of detection, command, and control, was the finest in the world. As coastal radar stations fed information into the system, plotting tables filled with the tracks of incoming raids. In the control rooms, men and women had to decide how to meet these threats. The rugged Hawker Hurricane, a stable gun platform, was tasked with attacking the bombers. The Spitfires, with their superior performance, were to tackle the hordes of deadly fighters that swarmed around the bomber formations. Yet, for the Spitfire pilots, the first call they always seemed to hear was a frantic brake, signaling they'd been bounced by 109s. A pilot quickly realized he was in a dangerous game, and the enemy was playing for keeps. Without any warning, a dozen or so 109s would descend upon them out of the sun, unseen and unheard, until someone shouted, "Brake, brake, brake, for Christ's sake, brake." In the ensuing chaos, one pilot saw a 109 dive right in front of him, having followed another Spitfire down, completely oblivious to his presence. For that British pilot, it was a golden opportunity, a gift from the gods of war. At the start of the Battle of Britain in July, the RAF was receiving 80 new Spitfires a month. By August, production had tripled, and 245 new Spitfires were delivered to replace the 133 destroyed in combat. Though the Hurricane made up the bulk of Fighter Command's strength and would account for more enemy aircraft destroyed, it was the distinctive, elliptical shape of the Spitfire that captured the people's imagination. High above them in the summer skies, they recognized the powerful beauty of Mitchell's design, and the Spitfire legend was born. The Spitfire stood for something profound during the Battle of Britain. It was an airplane that people could relate to, a unique and recognizable shape. On those clear days, civilians on the ground would watch them, specks in the sky going round and round amidst trails of smoke, a silent, deadly ballet overhead. In the air, RAF pilots would go in as a wing, 2 squadrons of Hurricanes and 2 of Spitfires, and squirt down a whole line of bombers. For a German crewman, the experience was terrifying. Suddenly, they were attacked from all directions by Hurricanes and Spitfires. It was a chaotic and fearsome sight. One German gunner recalled a disastrous day in July. His group, already weakened, was dispersed and savagely attacked. He watched in horror as his comrades were shot down one by one. About 7 pilots and their planes from his group were lost that day. The Spitfire possessed a tighter turning circle, and when facing one head-to-head, a German pilot's best hope was to turn upside down and dive for the nearest cloud. The German leadership, it turned out, was not accurately informed. They were not in a position to judge the Royal Air Force correctly and issue appropriate orders. The Royal Air Force was much stronger than the Luftwaffe had assumed, but the strength of the RAF did not rest solely on the Spitfire. A debate has long existed between those who favor the Hurricane and those who give more credence to the Spitfire. But the fact of the matter is simply this. The Battle of Britain could not have been won with only the Spitfire, but had the RAF not had the Spitfire, the Hurricane could not have won it on its own. The Spitfire was the indispensable key to victory. As the battle for freedom of the skies over Britain was won, the Spitfire continued to evolve. The Mark V Spitfire entered service in February of 1941. It was now armed with two powerful 20mm Hispano cannons in addition to its machine guns. However, these latest variants occasionally caused problems for the pilots adapting to them. The old models, with their 8 machine guns, had a simple button for a fire control, but the new system was far more complex. On top of the new stick was a tiny lever. One way was cannons, the other way was machine guns, another way was safe, and a fourth way fired both. One pilot recounted seeing a 109 coming straight at him, at the same level. He thought, "I've got a good chance here," armed with 2 cannons and 4 machine guns against the German's single cannon. He held his course, straight at him, until the German pilot pulled his nose up, exposing his belly. The British pilot pushed the button, worried he might blow both of them out of the sky. But nothing happened. He had left the selector on safe. The Royal Air Force was determined to take the fight to the enemy. Hoping to draw the Luftwaffe into battle, Fighter Command began a series of large fighter sweeps over enemy-occupied France. Now, the Spitfire was operating at the absolute limit of its range. The British pilots found themselves in the same disadvantaged position as the Luftwaffe pilots had been over England the year before. They would have to fly down to Manston to refuel just to make the long, perilous journey across the water. A pilot might spend 40 minutes flying flat out just to get to the fight, leaving him with only 15 minutes of combat time before having to turn back. These sweeps were not very successful, and the loss of life was tragically high. It was during this time that the Spitfire Mark Vs came face-to-face with early versions of Germany's latest fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190. With a top speed of almost 400 miles an hour, the FW-190 could execute turns and maneuvers at speeds that amazed the British pilots who clashed with it and lived to tell the tale. It soon earned the fearsome nickname Butcher Bird. To counter this new threat, the Spitfire's engineers worked tirelessly to develop a further variant of Mitchell's original design. They had to ensure they were keeping one step ahead of the enemy. To combat the Focke-Wulf 190, they had to increase the maneuverability of the aircraft. They added power-assisted ailerons, much like the power-assisted steering in a modern car, an innovation that was being pioneered on airplanes long before it was considered for automobiles. The engineers were given unexpected help when a Luftwaffe pilot, disoriented, landed his Focke-Wulf 190 at an RAF airfield by mistake. The German machine was examined closely, yielding its secrets. In June of 1942, the Spitfire Mark IX entered service. To the observer, it had all the familiar Spitfire features, but with a longer nose and 2 symmetrical radiators. With a top speed of nearly 410 miles an hour, the Mark IX restored the balance of power against the Focke-Wulf 190. With the Allied invasion of Europe, there was a new need for an aircraft capable of low-level attacks in support of the advancing armies. For this role, the Spitfire's wings were clipped to give better maneuverability at low altitudes. But the elegant fighter was tragically vulnerable to damage from the massive volume of small arms fire and flak that greeted these low-level sorties. The aircraft's radiators and coolant system, so essential to its high-performance engine, were its Achilles heel. If a bullet pierced the coolant system, the engine would seize in about 4 minutes. The Spitfire was designed as a high-altitude fighter interceptor, and a new generation of dedicated fighter bombers would prove more successful in the ground attack role. such as the powerful and sturdy Typhoon. It is a profound tribute to the advanced thinking behind Mitchell's original design that it was able to accommodate continuous upgrading to meet the ever-changing demands of the war, from high-altitude photo reconnaissance to carrier-borne operations. From the prototype onward, Rolls-Royce continuously upgraded the Merlin engine throughout the war. The aircraft got heavier and heavier and faster and faster. This was the stream of development that kept the Spitfire at the cutting edge. In fact, the Spitfire is the only Allied fighter aircraft to stay in production and see continuous service for the entire duration of the Second World War. By the war's end, it was nearly a third heavier, could climb 10,000 feet higher, and was 100 miles an hour faster than the original. But the world had entered the jet age, and the Spitfire's days as an operational combat aircraft were numbered. Gradually, it was tired off. The time came when no more Spitfires were being used by the RAF. A contract was issued for the Mark 24, but by then, the RAF didn't want them. They wanted jet planes. The Spitfire continued in operational service with the RAF until 1954. Over 22,500 Spitfires of all marks and variants had been built, and they had flown in every theater of war. R.J. Mitchell's advanced aerodynamic design had been the secret of its effectiveness and longevity. One of the things Mitchell was heard to say on a number of occasions was, "If it looks good, it is good." Those who built it felt a tremendous sense of pride because they knew they had a good one. It was the grace and beauty of the design, as well as the power of the aircraft, that captured the affection of those who flew it. One pilot confessed, "I fell a bit in love with the Spitfire. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and it was a fighter." In all its power and beauty, the Spitfire has come to represent the spirit that saved a nation in those desperate days when Britain stood alone. The Spitfire is in a class of its own. No matter how long the world goes on, it will be recognized as the aircraft responsible for contributing to victory on a scale greater than any other in the history of combat.